Dear all, this lecture is about academic writing in practice. My name is Kohtamäki. I work as a professor in School of Management, Strategic Business Development program. Regarding my background, I work as a professor of strategy. My research interests are digital servitization, organizational change, strategic practices, business intelligence, and strategic alliances. My teaching interests involve strategy work, servitization, and this academic writing. And I've published around 70 scientific journal articles, some books, and of course, a lot of conference papers and other publications. So hopefully I have some ideas in terms of how to write a case study, a scientific paper. We basically split the paper into 5 different chapters. The academic work is understood as a case study here. So my idea is here that I use case study as an example context. It can be a single case study or multiple case study, but the structure that I use here is typical for case studies, and of course the structure is mostly the same, independent of the method used in management studies. In quantitative papers, case studies, discursive papers, the main structures are more or less the same. But obviously, there are differences in terms of writing style and of course the methods, but also the argumentation structures, the way arguments are being used. Anyway, this is a brief introduction for the scientific paper and the structure of the scientific paper. So we have 5 chapters: introduction, theory, method, findings, and discussion. We go through slide by slide these 5 main chapters of a paper. So first, let's start from the introduction. What is the point of introduction in a case study, in an academic paper? It sets the hook. It motivates the reader. It intends to engage the reader to read your paper, to motivate and position your paper. So you focus exactly on the topic, engage the reader, you position, and you motivate. You remember that the issue of positioning, the fact that there is a need, there is a gap, there is an empty space in the literature for your paper, is basically not enough. It's nothing if you don't motivate, if there is no real need for this paper. So the motivation is extremely important. And this is, of course, the motivation is something that you do in the first section of the introduction. In the second section of the introduction, you basically position the paper. So you argue the gap. And this happens often so that you first tell what has been studied, then you tell what hasn't been studied, and then you underline, you highlight where's the gap. And of course you build these sections, so these sentences, so that they support your argumentation line. It's good to use direct quotes from previous studies, which are basically supporting your gap statements, are really good. What has been studied, what hasn't been studied, so where's the gap? And in the third section of the introduction, you argue how you fill in the gap. So the first section, you have 3 sections in the introduction. You motivate, you position, and then you tell how you fill the gap. So what is the contribution of your paper, your theoretical contribution, to which literature you are contributing to, and how you are going to do it, basically, in short. But this should not fill more than a few pages. So perhaps I would say maximum 10% of the length of the work, even less. I would say that less is better, but still the motivation and the position should be strong enough. So how do you position? How do you motivate? How do you position? And how do you argue how the paper fills in the gap? You motivate. You obviously define the main concept. You clearly, from the first sentence, the reader should be familiar and understand the focus of the paper. And that's how you write the sentences. In the first section, you define the main concept. You tell the reader that what's the point and how you define it. You argue both theoretical and empirical relevance of the object. You problematize the literature. You tell that what's the point of the paper, and why this is important for the literature, why this is important for companies. And this is something that you do in 15 rows, 10 to 15 rows. So it's relatively short. It's not too lengthy. 15 rows is a good writing. Position the article. The second section was about the positioning of the article. So what has been studied and what hasn't been studied, presentation of the gap without using the gap, extended problematization. You discuss about the gap and you contextualize the gap. You finalize by what previous research have neglected. So you tell that's why this paper is so relevant, because there is a gap in the existing literature. So really important is to motivate and then to present clearly, argue and present the gap so that the presentation is credible. And then, of course, you go more in depth in the third section and you argue the theoretical contribution. In the theoretical contribution, you also often state the research question. Then you argue that to which literature you are contributing to. Sometimes shortly in maximum one sentence, you state that what is the data and method you are using to contribute to extend the existing literature, and then you finalize the managerial value of the work. It's typical third section. Common mistakes. You fail to motivate and problematize. Insufficient justification for the importance of the topic. So your first section is a little bit vague. It says nothing. It's empty. It's not credible. What is important to remember is that not all the gaps need to be filled. So as such, the fact that there is a gap in the literature doesn't mean that the study is relevant. It should be motivated as well. Lack of focus. So you have too many research streams involved in the paper. You have too many focuses. You are not clear. Your introduction on writing is jumpy, so you're jumping from different topics to other. You have too many frameworks, etc. So many issues can go wrong, but these are some of the issues. Perhaps the main thing is to remember that first section motivates, second section presents the gap, and the third section presents how you fill in the gap, so you argue the contribution. And these you should do particularly clearly, so that it's understandable and clear for the reader. Then the second section, theory section, you create grounds for your research question, your argument, your study. Theories help us to achieve understanding, something that famous strategy professor Hamburg once said. So this is the core, the core of theorizing and theory building. We increase our understanding by theory development. Positioning of the paper and hypotheses against previous research. Of course, in case studies, you don't typically build hypotheses, but you still use very clear argumentation lines so that the reader kind of can read what is the main assumption in the theory and in the argumentation. So the structure is very clear, even if you are not explicitly stating hypotheses. Clear logical argumentation structure, and often state that from more generic to more specific. So you start from the context, you move forward towards the lenses that you are using, and then eventually you discuss exactly about the lens you are using in that context you are studying, from more generic to more specific. So really clear and logical argumentation structure throughout. Use prior studies to back up your claims, and tell about the content of prior studies. So tell that how specific study, Kohtamäki et al. Studied that and this and that data and found these and these results. So use those types of empirical studies that build build grounds for your theorizing, for your research question. And you don't just use them as reference, but you actually tell that what they did and what type of findings they achieved. But in this demo, so you build by other studies, you build the argumentation. This would be the best way to do it. Obviously, often that's not the case. You can also use a table. So you can use a table to present the main prior studies related to your research question. For instance, in the table, you could have, let's say, 4 columns. The first column would be that who were the study authors. Then the second would be the study focus. The third could be data and method. And then the fourth would be main findings. By this study, if you would have, let's say, 10 to 15 studies in the table, by one table, you would clearly already demonstrate the main readings, the main papers that you are using in your study. So This would demonstrate the reading, and this would be important for the theory building and for the reader to understand the context, theoretical context. Create sense of coherence. So this is about the argumentation, of how you build the argument so that it progresses and creates a coherent picture, consistent picture. Easy to makes it understandable, easier to understand, etc. Okay, and the good practices and the process. You substantiate your hypothesis. If you have hypothesis, then particularly clear explanation why A leads B and how C moderates A and the relationship between A and B. So why the causality exists. So this is in those types of studies where you use hypothesis. Let's say quantitative studies is particularly important. So that's the core. In cases, this is even more difficult because you don't have necessarily like one hypothesis. So you have to have really clear idea what your study is demonstrating, so that you are actually building this argument throughout. You utilize multiple theories. Often you have a main theory, let's say theory one, that's a servitization, and then you have a second theory, let's say capabilities. So you're using capability lens to study servitization, capabilities in servitization. So you would have theory one, servitization, and theory two, capabilities. And obviously you would be filling in the gap in servitization research from the capability perspective. So this would be how you use the lens to understand or how to fill in the gap. You're filling it in from the perspective of the lens you are building in the theory. And creating the coherent flow of argumentation, use of many constructs, multiple theories, and large body of literature can't lead to inconsistent and scattered narrative. And this is often a problem, that the flow of argument is not clear. You are presenting many different references and many different theories or concepts, but you are not writing or crafting a clear argumentation line. And this is kind of one of the biggest issues in what separates good writing from bad. So coherence, coherent logical argumentation line. So you need to be parsimonious. You need to be clear. You need to decide clearly which are the main concepts, and then devote and use those concepts throughout the work, and avoid using too many concepts. Still, you need to be comprehensive, but from a very specific argument, you need to say all instead of saying something vague, a lot of different stuff from a broad topic. That would be the mistake. The biggest mistake and the most typical one. So common mistakes, lost argumentation line. So you engage reviewing the previous studies without an argumentation line. So you review studies, but you are not building a lens. You're not building an argument. You're not building a lens. You're just doing a review. That's not the way to do it. So you need to know towards which argument you are building the lens, what type of studies you need to build the lens. You need to know the literature broadly, of course, in order to find the relevant papers, the relevant studies to discuss about the topic. So you will not find immediate 10 white papers. You need to perhaps go through 400 papers and their abstracts in order to find 30 relevant, or 20 relevant, or 10 relevant. And that's the case. Missing review on previous research. So you are just making general claims and citing a lot of papers without actually doing a review, without actually going in depth into those relevant previous studies. Lack of specificity. So you are broad, not specific. Broad claims on general topics. And you are using fragmented. You have a fragmented theory. So you're using huge number of references, but you are not making any clear point. You're stating the obvious. You are not building a relevant, credible argument, interesting argument, but you are just making obvious statements and adding references. That's not interesting. In the method section, so the third section would be about the method. The third chapter always is about the methodology. So in methodology, you describe the methods and data. You argue methodological choices made in the study. So you don't write a review about research methods, but you exactly focus on the method you used in the study. Clarify the used methods, you argue validity, why the results can be trusted, you address the case selection, data collection and data analysis, and you describe the data. The process and good practices. You describe how the cases were selected and why the industry, why the specific cases. You describe how the data was collected. You describe what the data collection methods were utilized and how the data was collected. So interviews, written materials, observations, for instance, strategy documents, media documents. Different types of interviews can be separated. Of course, if you are using interviews from the case company, but then you are using also some more general expert interviews, those may be different data sources that should be separated, etc. And the fourth really important thing is that you describe how the data was analyzed. So what was the data analysis method? Narrative analysis, discourse analysis, content analysis, grounded theory, etc. And fifth, you describe the data structure. So you clearly describe how you draw the findings from the data. So you use so-called data structure method from Gioia. So Korlev and Gioia 2007 is an example paper often used in terms of data structure, but there are many other papers available. Gioia has been a huge proponent and developer of this data structure type of method should be used. So you describe basically how your main findings, the third really conceptual categories, are drawn from the first order categories, which are clear let's say interview quotes or observations from the data. So those are really low level, small categories, which are then conceptualized already to a little bit broader categories at the second layer. And then at the third level, you are really finding the let's say 3 to 5 main findings, main categories from the data. This type of data structure, hierarchical data structure, illustrates the best, illustrates very, I'm not sure if it's the best, but illustrates very well how the conclusions or the findings are drawn from the empirical data in this type of case study method. So it's using data structure in the data analysis is extremely important, and then of course you are using, for instance, a table to present direct quotes and observations regarding the first level categories that you were recognizing. So this demonstrates then the validity of your interpretations at the lowest first level category. Common mistakes: not arguing the case selection. So you assume that readers are interested about the case, but you don't argue why you so chose the case. Extremely important. Why the large academic audience or any readers for your work would be interested on the case studied here. Mixing of data collection and analysis. So separate the data collection and analysis methods. It's really important. So how the data was collected and how the data was analyzed. Those are very different things. They shouldn't be mixed. And considering case study only as a method, so you say that you are using case study, but you don't explicate how you collected data or how you analyze the data, but you assume that stating that you are using case study actually is enough. That obviously is not. It's not how it is. And then the findings, the results, the findings. The purpose of the findings section: demonstrate the findings of the study in a structured manner. Demonstrate and explain the findings. Use observations, examples, and interview excerpts, quotes, to provide evidence to support the interpretations. Make interpretations and compare against the theory. Not always, and depends a bit on the style and the style of the paper and the writing style. Provide summary of the results in a form of table or final picture at the end of the results. This is important. So from my perspective, you need to demonstrate the contribution very clearly. It's not always the case. You are not always using a picture or figure to do this, but often I have found at least that it's a good way. So at the end of the findings section, you summarize the main findings by one figure. For instance, you would be studying servitization of the company and using capability lens. So the picture at the end of the findings section would describe the capabilities needed in servitization, for instance. So then you would know throughout the work that figure would be the figure towards you are writing your whole scientific work. So that's the main idea of the writing. The process and good practices. Well, you sketch the results and the data structure. You analyze the data, you build the data structure, then you know that what type of third level dimensions you are conceptualizing from the data, as those will structure your findings. Obviously, if you are doing multiple cases, then you would do the data structure for each case, and you would first present each case separately within case analysis, and then in the second phase of analysis, you would do cross-case analysis, which would be based on the themes you identified as the third order dimensions in the data structure. And then at the end, you summarize the results by the figure. So if this would be a single case study, then obviously how I would structure the findings would be the 4.1 would be the presentation of the case. Then the 4.2 would be the case analysis, meaning the themes. And then the 4.3 would be the synthesis from the single case study. if this would be a multiple case study, I would use something like the attached sketch. So first you start by presenting the data structure, or then you are presenting the data structure already in the end of the method. Perhaps that's the best. Then if that would be the case, that you present the data structure already in the method section, then the 4.1 would be the within case analysis, 4.2 the cross case analysis, and 4.3 the summary of the results by a figure. Common mistakes: doing only case presentation. So you are just using huge amount of space for case presentation without actually doing any analysis, or doing analysis in a mixed way without argumentation structure, without clearly writing the analysis for the reader. You're just using huge amount of quotes, interview quotes, again without doing analysis. Often in my works we use tables to collect the quotes, and then we write the findings section so that it could be read as an interesting narrative, as an interesting story, as interesting as possible, without the quotes, so that we make sure that the narrative, how the findings section is written, creates such a coherent narrative that it's interesting for the reader, because that's often the difficult part, that you keep adding a lot of quotes without, and then losing the narrative, losing an interesting narrative. Or you are doing a lot of description without analysis. So you're not actually answering to any why question, but you are just describing something. So this would be also dangerous. And often how I see it also is that I use already references and previous studies in the results section, so that I compare already at this point the results against the existing theory, because that helps in terms of it adds interest and adds value for the reader. In the final section, in the final chapter, you do the discussion. In the discussion section, you highlight the contribution of the work, you state the contribution, you highlight the managerial contributions, you explicate the limitations, and then you do the suggestions for future research. In terms of the theoretical contribution, you get back to the purpose of the work and the research question. You state the theoretical contribution, how this work contributes to the prior studies, to the literature you intended to contribute. In my examples, for instance, the servitization literature. You write against previous studies, against the central prior studies that relate to your work, and which you referenced already and which you explicated already in the theoretical section. And you rather write a longer discussion section instead of shorter. Minimum 5% of the work. But I can say that often it's too short. So mostly researchers are already too tired at this point, and they think that only stating the repeating the findings would be enough, and saying something empty about managerial implications, that would be enough, but it's not. It is a really important part in terms of communicating the core of your study and the real value of your study. In addition to theoretical contribution, you state the managerial implications. You highlight the value of the findings for the managers and companies. And third, you state the limitations. For instance, a small number of cases and blah, blah, blah. but also truly, in a truest sense, that how do you really see that what are the limitations of the work. So it's important to address the issue. And in addition, you of course make the suggestions for future research, and you really consider that what are the main suggestions for future research, and you do this consideration carefully. And the common mistakes at this point are that you actually forget to address the theoretical contribution. You just repeat the results, the findings again, and the whole section of the whole chapter comes about the findings. You make weak, empty managerial suggestions, a few empty managerial statements, and then you don't really make any real suggestions for future research. And actually the whole discussion section feels like a little bit cramped, quickly implemented. Researcher was already too tired at this point and didn't really make an effort to highlight the contribution, the managerial implications, the true limitations, and suggestions for future research. It's important to do this properly, and not to undermine the value of your study. To finalize, we went through the 5 chapters typical for any scientific work: introduction, theory, method, findings, and discussion. And we highlighted the issue that before you start writing the work, you should already understand and see that towards what type of preliminary finding or you should have a preliminary idea about the finding, about the figure or the picture that you see in the end of the findings section. That preliminary idea will carry the theory, and you should have that sort of empty version, only theoretical version and quite empty version of the framework in the end of the theory section, because that generates the lens how you are studying the case. And then you do the method, the case selection, the data collection methods, and the data analysis properly. You do the data structure, and then you structure the findings depending on whether it's single case study or multiple case study, and you do the theme-based writing or analysis. Now, and then you do the discussion. Now, these kind of brief instructions and guidelines were not to say that this is the only right way to do it. There are many ways. Perhaps the main structures stick, and you shouldn't perhaps try to reinvent the wheel. But within those structures, within those frames, there is a lot of freedom for creativity. So I would suggest that you use the creativity within those structures, and carefully consider what is stated in these slides, because these slides are based on the guidelines of Academy of Management Journal. So in that sense, I would say that they should be somehow valid and helpful at least. So hopefully this was useful for your consideration when you consider how to build up your scientific work, and what type of structures and what type of argumentation structure you should be using, and how to do it in practice. Thank you.